evening, friends. This is Thomas Walker, once again coming to you from a quiet corner of the night. Tonight, I bring you the beginning of a story that twists and turns across the breadth of America. A story born of fear, of greed, and of trust misplaced. Our tale begins in late September of 1937. The world was still in the long gray shadow of the Great Depression. Out on the roads near Chicago, autumn's chill had already begun to seep into the fields and the trees. It was a country not yet at war, but always braced for trouble. And on one lonely stretch of North Avenue, as the sun went down, trouble came looking. Charles Sherman Ross was a man who had known success. 72 years old, gray-haired, and respected. He had once been the president of the George S. Carrington Greeting Card Company. But that evening he was no titan of business. He was simply a man driving toward the city, with a friend by his side, and a vague feeling of unease. Miss Florence Freihage, his former secretary and lifelong companion, sat next to him as the big sedan rolled on through the gathering dark. Ross glanced in the mirror. "The car behind," he said. His voice tense, "has been following us a long time, and with those lights so bright." He pulled over to let it pass, but the other car swung sharply in front of them, blocking the road. Out stepped a young man with curly hair and a pointed face, a revolver glinting in his hand. John Henry Seed Lund. Unknown to Ross and Freihage, he was a man with a restless heart, a history of crimes, and a mind already set on a grim course. He tapped the gun against the driver's side window, cold and calm. Ross hesitated, just a second too long, and Seedlund made his demand clear. "This is a kidnapping," he said. Miss Freihage pleaded, offering the small amount of cash she carried, but it was no use. Ross was marched at gunpoint into the waiting car, where a second man, James Atwood Gray, sat behind the wheel. And just like that, Charles S. Ross disappeared into the night. Miss Freihage, trembling, waited until the kidnappers were gone, then rushed to the nearest telephone. By the time the police arrived, Ross and his captors were already deep into the black heart of the countryside, heading north, where a cold dugout in the woods of Minnesota waited for them. The days that followed brought letters. Strange, stiffly worded ransom notes, typed and mailed from different towns demanding $50,000. Ross's family, desperate to save him, played along. Advertisements were placed in newspapers, secret messages exchanged, and always, always the same grim warning: obey, or he dies. As the days slipped by, the messages grew colder. Proof of life was promised. Photographs of Ross holding that day's newspaper, looking weary but still breathing. The hand of the kidnappers seemed careful, even clever. The ransom drop was arranged. A motorcycle rider on a lonely Illinois highway, the cash thrown into the dark as instructed. $50,000 vanished into the night. And yet, no Charles Ross came home. The ransom had been paid, but no word came. No meeting, no joyful return. Only a silence that seemed to thicken by the hour. By October 19th, the truth could no longer be denied. Charles Ross was not coming home. The FBI threw everything it had into the case. Agents fanned out across the country, checking highways, riverbanks, abandoned cabins, interviewing drifters and small-town waitresses, chasing every whisper of a lead, the ransom money, marked carefully by serial numbers, became the Bureau's beacon. Lists were circulated to banks, shops, hotels, anyone who might touch a dollar bill. And sure enough, slowly, the bills began to surface. A stray $5 note here in Nebraska, a crisp 20 tucked into a grocery payment in New York. Little flashes of light in the darkness, each one tracing a line toward the one responsible. The pattern was scattered, erratic. Whoever carried the money was moving fast. Chicago, Denver, Spokane, Miami, New Orleans, an endless trail of cheap motels and smoky racetracks. Someone restless, someone trying to stay ahead of the past. And then a clue too bold to ignore. In Los Angeles, ransom bills began turning up at the Santa Anita racetrack, a place where fortunes changed hands every minute and a man could lose himself in the crowd. Director Hoover himself took command. Agents disguised as cashiers set a quiet trap behind the betting counters, waiting for the right gambler to come along, carrying the wrong money. January 14th, 1938. A man approached the window. Young, sharp-faced, steady-eyed. He handed over a bill, and the agent, heart steady, checked the serial number. A match. In a flash, the plan snapped shut. The man was seized, hustled away without a sound. His name, he said, was Peter Ander. But under the layers of falsehood, the FBI found another name. John Henry Seedlund, logger, wanderer, bank thief, and the last man to see Charles S. Ross alive. At first, Seedlund smiled thinly and lied, said he'd gotten the money from a friend, said he didn't know anything about a kidnapping. But as the night wore on and the evidence piled around him, something inside him cracked, and out spilled a confession. 28 pages long, heavy with the weight of cold, hard deeds. He told them everything: the kidnapping, the ransom drop, the long bitter flight across the country, and the terrible moment in a lonely woods in Wisconsin, where a struggle between Seedlund, his partner Gray, and Charles Ross had ended in 2 deaths and a shallow grave under a cover of brush and snow. The bodies were still out there, somewhere beyond the reach of the trains and roads, still hidden by the woods, still waiting under the frozen earth. And so the agents prepared for a journey, not to rescue, but to recover. And now, with the map drawn in words from his own mouth, the FBI set out into the frozen north, on a grim and silent hunt. Through waist-high drifts they trudged, horses and sleds leading the way. Seedlund, manacled but calm, pointed out the trail markers, a bullet-riddled road sign, a twisted stand of birch trees. All the while, the cold gnawed at their fingers and at their hearts. There, beneath a rough pile of branches and ice, they found it, a dugout lined with wood deep in the earth. The first hideout, a place where Charles S. Ross had spent the final days of his life, held fast in the cold and the dark, waiting for a freedom that would never come. But the journey wasn't done. Not yet. Farther on, near a tangle of abandoned rail tracks, they brushed aside a layer of snow and uncovered a typewriter case. Inside, packed tight and cold as stone, $32,000 in ransom bills. The lost price of a man's life. And finally, at the second hideout, near Spooner, Wisconsin, the last secret was laid bare. There, in a shallow pit, beneath a sagging roof of branches, lay 2 bodies. One, the body of James Atwood Gray, the unlucky partner. The other, the remains of Charles Sherman Ross, who had once ridden toward Chicago with hope in his heart, and who now lay still beneath the indifferent sky. Sid Lund, who once dreamed of perfect crimes and easy fortunes, found himself before a court, silent and without defense. He was sentenced to death, and in July of 1938, not long before what would have been his 28th birthday, he sat down in the electric chair at Cook County Jail. His life ended quietly, almost unnoticed, and yet in the empty places he left behind, the back roads of Illinois, the frozen woods of Minnesota, and the lonely graveyards where small markers sink slowly into the earth, the echoes of his choices remain. Of the $50,000 paid in desperation and fear, most was recovered. A few bills here and there slipped through the cracks, perhaps still folded inside the dusty walls of forgotten buildings, perhaps long ago spent and forgotten. Little tokens of a night when the world tilted sideways and never quite righted itself. And so we leave this story, friends, with a question, lingering like mist along the empty road. What price, in the end, can ever be set for a man's life? And when darkness comes for us, will we know it, even when it wears a familiar face? This has been Thomas Walker, wishing you peace and safe travels wherever your road may lead.